In the frozen silence of Montana's backwoods, the ranger's cabin stood like a scar carved into time itself. Its timbers groaned under years of neglect, a hollow shell swallowed by storm and shadow. Inside, a woman dangled upside down, ropes cutting into her skin. Every ragged breath, a coin she could no longer afford to spend. Beyond the cabin walls, the blizzard raged, yet something moved. Massive, scarred, unyielding. A black horse, taller than any man, emerged from the storm. Its eyes glowed with a feral fire, but its steps carried more than instinct, they carried intention. What followed would blur the line between predator and protector. The beast was no mere animal. It was a sentinel born of legend, its presence rewriting the silence of Red Hollow. That night, the forest itself seemed to choose sides. January had fallen hard on Red Hollow. Winters were no stranger here, but this one was crueler, heavier, as if the sky itself wished to bury the town. Snow crushed rooftops, swallowed porches, erased streets into blank ribbons of pale silence. Even the creek, the town's restless heartbeat, had frozen stiff beneath glassy ice. The cold stole sound, leaving behind only the sharp cracks of branches breaking under their icy tombs, like distant gunfire echoing through the valleys. From the ridgelines, the mountains loomed merciless, their faces blank with indifference. The wind slashed down invisible corridors, rattling pine needles like brittle bones. And still, something heavier pressed on Red Hollow. Night stretched too long, the silence too thick. Farmers and shopkeepers whispered it. The forest was not sleeping, it was watching, waiting. 7 miles north of Main Street, hidden among skeletal trees, the ranger's cabin stood. Once a place of warmth and duty, it was now a corpse of cedar and rot. Shingles curled like dead leaves. Glass had shattered into jagged teeth. Plywood moaned whenever the storm clawed at its seams. Inside, the stench of mildew and rust clung to the air, damp earth swallowing its history. Locals called it dead ground. They passed wide, muttering that the woods had reclaimed it, that only a fool would step inside. But that night, someone had. And as the black horse drew nearer, its hooves striking sparks against frozen stone, the woman inside lifted her head just in time to see the door shudder. Not from the storm, from something far stranger. Because when the cabin door finally cracked open, it wasn't just the horse that stepped in. It was something riding inside the horse's shadow. It was along this very stretch of wilderness that Maren Holt disappeared. Maren was 32, a seasoned ranger who knew red hollows, mountains, and valleys the way a sailor knows the sea. She had been born here, raised among the same pines and winters that had hardened generations of her family. Her reputation was one of grit and calm, resolve. When hikers strayed too far or hunters didn't come home, it was often Maren who led the search parties, her boots breaking trail through the snow long after others had given up. People trusted her. She had once found a group of lost school children after 3 nights in. The cold, carrying one of them on her back the last mile out of the woods. Stories like that had made her not just respected, but beloved. On a Tuesday afternoon, she'd signed out of the ranger station. Her last words to the dispatcher being that she was heading north to check the boundary and lines and make sure no poachers were operating after the season. Nothing about it had seemed unusual. She wore her heavy parka, carried her field pack, and drove her old Rangerissu pickup toward the tree line. By dusk, though, something was wrong. At 7 p.m., her radio crackled, static, and then went dead, and the signal cut mid-sentence, dissolving into a sharp burst of white noise before silence swallowed it completely. Repeated calls brought no response. At first, the team assumed it was weather interference, but when the minutes stretched into an hour, unease turned into alarm. By 9 a.m., the search party had gone out. They found her truck idling at the mouth of the forest road, headlights half buried in snow. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's seat was shoved back hastily, and the floor was smeared with mud and slush as though someone had left in a rush. Outside, faint boot prints marked the first stretch of trail leading northward into the trees. But the storm had come through hard that night, sweeping the forest clean. Within 100 yards, the tracks disappeared into a blanket of untouched white. It was as though Maren had walked into the storm and been erased from the world. By morning, the town buzzed with rumors. Flyers with her picture were plastered to the post office wall, the diner's bulletin board, the glass door of the hardware store. People whispered in the grocery aisles and leaned close at the gas pumps. Where had she gone? Some swore they had seen strange lights flickering in the woods at night, pale, beams that vanished when approached. A few hunters muttered about shadows. moving near the old ranger cabin, as though someone had taken up residence there again. Others insisted it must have been an accident, Marin injured somewhere, waiting to be found. But the longer she remained missing, the darker the theories became. The old folks in town said the forest didn't forget. They warned of restless ground, of places where the trees grew too close and the air pressed too heavy, where the living didn't belong. The forest doesn't sleep. One gay-haired trapper muttered over his coffee at the diner. It takes what it wants. Sheriff Elias McCree felt the pressure mounting. At 61, McCree was steady and deliberate, a man who preferred long silences before speaking and who hated rushing to judgment. He had seen his share of storms, both natural and human, and his instinct was always to wait until the snow settled before making a move. But this time, he could feel the town's weight on his shoulders. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men who once worked the logging yard stopped by his office, asking what was being done. They wanted answers. They wanted their ranger back. McCree knew too well what it meant if she wasn't found dead soon. Cold nights in the Montana wilderness did not forgive delays. The search efforts widened. Rescue teams fanned out along the ridges, combing the frozen ground with flashlights and thermal scopes. Dogs were brought in their noses, low tails stiff. For a few hours, they pulled eagerly along a trail, sniffing something unseen. But as the storm thickened, the animals faltered. Whining, they lost the scent, circling in confusion before sitting down in the snow as though the forest itself had swallowed the trail. Men shouted Marin's name into the trees, their voices swallowed by wind, flare. Guns cracked the sky, casting red light across the canopy, but revealed nothing. Hours turned into a full day. A second night came and went. The searchers huddled by fires, their eyes red from exhaustion, and still no Marin. No broken branches, in be it. No scraps of clothing, no blood, no sign at all. By the third day, official reports carried only the barest facts. Ranger Marin Holt, missing, last seen. Tuesday afternoon, pickup found abandoned, no confirmed leads. But facts did little to ease the fear. In Red Hollow, people no longer asked if she was in trouble. They asked instead where she had been taken and by whom. The forest stood mute, the snow unbroken, as though holding its secrets too tightly for any human hand to pry. Loose. And somewhere beyond the reach of lantern light and radios, a presence moved in the silence, watching, awaiting, carrying with it the scent of blood and fear. The storm had broken by. Midnight, leaving the forest wrapped in a muffled quiet. The snow lay heavy on the branches, bending them low, a fresh white mantle disguising every scar of the night before. The air was brittle, each breath sharp in the lungs, and the moon hung pale and round above the ridgeline. It was in that hour, when even the wind seemed too tired to move, that the forest's most elusive inhabitant emerged from the shadows. He was massive, a beast, forged by hardship and survival. Nearly 18 hands high at the shoulder, his frame was built like living stone, broad chest flanks, thick with muscle, legs, corded and powerful. His coat was a black so pure it seemed to devour the light around him, the sheen of it glinting faintly silver, where the moonlight kissed the snow. On his left shoulder, a long ridge scar cut across the smoothness of his hide, a permanent mark left by a chain that once bit too deep. His name was not known to most, but to the few who whispered about him, he was Onyx, the Black Sentinel of the woods. Every step he took pressed deep into the snow with a muffled thud heavy enough to echo. Yet, when he chose, he could move with uncanny silence, vanishing like smoke between the trees. There were loggers who swore they had glimpsed him from a distance, an immense shape moving at the tree line. Hunters claimed their rifles shook when his amber eyes met theirs through the branches. Children huddled around winter fires told stories of the shadow horse, the ghost guardian who watched the woods. Some called him a monster, some a miracle. All agreed he was untouchable. Once, though, he had been anything but free. Onyx had not always belonged to the forest. Years ago, he had been little more than property in a rough camp, a nameless brute destined for work and cruelty. His size, even as a cult, had marked him for hard labor. They chained him to timber sledges, forced him to pull loads that bent his young frame. They strapped harnesses until his skin tore and used the crack of leather whips to keep him moving. He had been trained to fight as well, pitted against other horses in brutal tests of dominance meant to entertain men who had long ago forgotten compassion. The scar across his shoulder, the faint notches along his legs, the wary fire in His eyes, all were reminders of that life. But the forest had other plans. One night, as a storm ripped across the valley, lightning split the sky and rain turned the ground into a churned me. The men were careless, and the gate was weak. With a surge of rage and desperate strength, Onyx hurled himself forward, splintering the wooden posts, shattering chains that had bound him for years. He tore into the night like a phantom, his hooves striking sparks on the stones, his bellow lost in the thunder. By dawn, he was gone. The men searched, but the forest swallowed him whole, and he became nothing more than rumor. Since then, he had lived wild. The mountains carved him into something larger than legend, and the winters honed his endurance. He was seen only rarely, his presence marked more often by the deep crescent of his hoof prints pressed into the snow, or the sudden silence of birds when he passed. For the people of Red Hollow, he was both fear and fascination, a living monument of strength, unbroken and unbending. That night, as the storm's last flurries drifted down, Onyx moved along the northern pines, his head lowered to the ground, nostrils flaring. He had been searching for forage among the buried shoots and bark when the wind carried something strange to him, a scent unlike deer or wolf or elk. It was sharp and sour, layered with sweat, the tang of iron, and something darker blood. His ears pricked every nerve, suddenly alive. This was not the smell of prey or predator. It was the smell of pain, of danger. Instinct rooted him for a moment, then drove him forward. He raised his head, snorted steam into the frozen air, and turned toward the source. His stride quickened. Snow sprang beneath his hooves. The scent grew stronger with each breath. Onyx navigated the forest with uncanny certainty, muscles shifting beneath his coat ears, swiveling at every snap of a twig. The smell led him toward a clearing. Most creatures avoided a place of rot and shadow. The abandoned Rears's cabin. The structure crouched among the trees like a wounded beast. Its roof sagged beneath the weight of snow. The windows, shattered long ago, stared blankly into the night. Boards rattled and moaned in the wind, and the gaps between them glowed faintly with a pale, sickly light from within. The place wry of mildew, rust, and something fouler, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of grief. Men spoke of it as curs. Onyx did not know curses, but his instincts screamed of danger. He approached slowly, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His hooves sank silently into the drifts. He lowered his head, pressing one eye close to a crack in the rotting wood, and what he saw inside froze him where he stood suspended from a beam in the center of the cabin was a woman. She hung upside down, her wrists and ankles bound with coarse rope that cut deep into her skin. Her uniform was torn. Mud and snow caked across it, the badge missing but still recognizable as ranger attire. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold strands of sweat, soaked hair clinging to her cheeks. Blood had rushed to her head, leaving her features swollen and red. Each shallow breath rattled in her chest. She was alive, but barely. The smell inside the cabin struck him, like a blow with a heavy damp of mold and rust. The copper tang of dried blood, the sourness of fear and exhaustion. It was suffocating. Onyx flinched, pulling back for a heartbeat, but his eyes never left her. He did not understand uniforms or duty, but he knew in life when he saw it, and he knew it was slipping away. Something primal stirred in him, the same drive that had once helped him survive, now repurposed. This was not prey, not predator. This was a life crying out for rescue. He lowered his head, ears pressed forward, listening intently. The cabin was silent except for the creak of rope and the faint wee of the woman's breath. No other footsteps, no human voices. Whoever had done this was not here, at least not yet. Onyx shifted his weight, pawing at the ground, the sound muffled in the snow, but steady, a rhythm of defiance. Then he reared his head back and let out a sound that split the night. His neigh rang through the forest, a deep, thunderous call that echoed across the trees. It was no ordinary cry, but a declaration raw and commanding, as if to say, "I am here, I have seen." The sound carried for miles, startling owls from their roosts, sending deer fleeing into the dark. Inside the cabin, the woman stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with exhaustion, and she turned, her head just enough to glimpse the black silhouette outside the door. For a moment, her lips parted in disbelief. A horse, massive, wild, was standing guard outside her prison. Her body quivered with the effort, but she managed to flex her ankle against the rope. Her boot heel tapped once, against the wooden beam. A faint sound, but distinct. Onyx's ears flicked. He heard it. He pawed harder, stamping into the snow. With a force that shook the boards of the cabin, she tapped again, weaker, but it was enough. A connection bridged the space between them. Wordless, yet undeniable, she was calling, and he was answering. Onyx threw his weight against the cabin door. The wood-grown dust falling from the lintel again. He struck with his chest and shoulder muscles rippling. The door shuddered, but held reinforced with rusted chains and locks. He tried again, a snort of frustration bursting from his nostrils, but the barrier refused to yield. The cabin seemed to mock him with its stubborn resistance. He stepped back, pacing a tight circle, in the snow, his hooves crunching and hissing. He pressed his muzzle against the cracks, inhaling the woman's scent. Memorizing it, he pawed at the earth again, restless, impatient. His instincts screamed to act to save, but something older, wiser within him recognized the truth. Not now. The door was too strong, the danger not yet past. He could not break her free alone, not yet. For a long moment, he lingered, breath-steaming body trembling with the urge to destroy the walls that kept her captive. The woman's eyes closed again, her body sagging, but he knew her presence now. He carried it in his memory like a brand. He would not forget. He would not abandon her. The cabin faded behind him, but the image did not. Even as Onyx pressed his great body into the drifts, each hoof sinking deep with a crunch that shattered the stillness. He kept turning his head ears, flicking back, toward the sagging roof where the woman hung. His breath steamed in the air like smoke from a forge. The forest had grown utterly silent again, as though holding its breath in, the aftermath of his cry. He carried her scent with him now, sweat, blood, and fear etched into his memory like fire and wood. The night was thick with shadow. The storm had calmed, but the sky still wept, flakes that drifted lazily through the branches and clung to his mane. He moved with purpose, his stride long, his neck arched the weight of the snow, hissing as it shifted under his steps. From time to time, he stopped, lifted his head, and glanced back through the pines. He would not forget where the Winnenly cabin stood. He could find it again, no matter how the storm tried to erase its tracks. Clamped between his teeth was something small but precious, an object he had pulled from near the woman's prison. The copper tang of blood stained its fabric, but the smell was human alive. A ranger's hat, its crest still, stitched on the band darkened by a smear of dried red. He did not know its meaning, but an instinct told him it was part of her, part of the one who still breathed. If he could not break the cabin, then perhaps he could carry this, a signal, a message. The lights of Red Hollow were faint in the distance when he broke from the tree line. The town slept, roofs buried beneath white, the streets abandoned. Only one corner showed life. A squat wooden building on the outskirts, its porch lamp glowing amber against the drifts. A weathered sign swung on rusted chains above the door, its paint peeling, but still legible: Bennett Animal Clinic. Inside, Dr. Naomi Bennett was finishing Hair Day. The small clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, a mixture that clung to her hair and clothes. She moved briskly from room to room, wiping counters, securing medicine cabinets, checking the latches on kennels where 2 barn cats drowsed. She was 29 with pale hands nicked from years of work, light brown hair tied in, a loose knot at the base of her neck. Her frame was slight, her movements precise, but her eyes clear, steady hazel, were what people trusted most. Naomi had been raised in these rooms. Her father, Dr. Alan Bennett, had run the clinic until his passing 5 years ago. His reputation carved from decades of treating the sick and the unwanted. Dogs dropped at his doorstep, injured hawks, half-starved mustangs. When Naomi inherited the clinic, some doubted she could carry that weight. But over time, the town learned that her touch was something different, almost uncanny. Animals that resisted others calmed beneath her hand. Wounded creatures seemed to linger just long enough when she worked on them. Bennett hands, people said, hands that heal. And once years earlier, those hands had touched Onyx. He had been a young colt, then still, smaller, though already formidable. She had found him collapsed near a stream, gashes on his legs, hide marred by lashes. Someone had driven him too hard, beaten him until he fled. Naomi, still in training under her father, had hidden him in the back pen, cleaned his wounds, fed him oats by hand. For 2 weeks she tended him, speaking in whispers so no one else would hear. One morning, she opened the gate and watched him vanish into the forest, never expecting to see him again. But she had never forgotten the amber eyes that had looked back once, just once, before the trees swallowed him whole. That memory came rushing back the moment she heard the sound outside. It was subtle at first, a deep, deliberate thud, snow compacting beneath tremendous weight. Then another, the rhythm of power, steady, unhurried, too heavy to be the deer that often prowled near the alley, too deliberate to be the wind. Naomi froze, where she stood, one hand still on the switch that would extinguish the clinic's lights. Her heart climbed into her throat. The noise grew louder, closer, until it reached the edge of the porch. She turned, breath-held eyes straining against the glow of the street lamp. From the darkness stepped a shape that seemed too large to be real, a towering horse, its coat black as ink snow, glittering against its mane and shoulders. Steam curled from its nostrils, catching the lamplight in silver tendrils. On its left shoulder ran a scar she recognized even before she fully comprehended the rest. Onyx, she whispered. The name she had given him in secret all those years ago, when she wrapped his wounds. The great animal lowered his head, muscles rolling beneath his hide, and with a careful movement dropped something onto the wooden step. The sound of fabric hitting wood was shockingly small compared to his size. Naomi, heart hammering, stepped forward, her boots crunching in the snow. She bent down, her fingers trembling as they closed around the object. It was Heir's hat. The crest was unmistakable, stitched with the pine tree and star. The fabric was stiff, stained with blood, now dark and brittle. Turning it under the porch light, she saw the faint stitching inside a name. M. Halt. Naomi's breath hitched. Marin Hole, one of the most respected rangers in the county. Missing for 2 days, the subject of every whispered conversation in town, her photo taped to storefronts. Naomi stared at the blood-darkened fabric, her pulse surging. She lifted her head slowly. On stood unmoving before her, his amber eyes fixed on hers, his breath fogged, the air slow and steady, his chest rising like a great bellows. There was no fear in him, no wild twitching, no aggression, only a stillness that felt deliberate, almost human, as though he was waiting for her to understand. "You brought this," she murmured. Her voice cracked against the cold night. "You're showing me where she island." Onyx stamped one hoof into the snow, the sound deep and final, then stood like a statue. Naomi's thoughts spun. She remembered binding his wounds, feeding him when he was nothing but pain. And defiance. He had not forgotten. Now he had. Returned, not for himself, but for someone else. Her hands shook as she clutched the hat. Tighter. She could feel the dried blood against her palm, the weight of the truth, settling in her chest. Somewhere out there, Marin Holt was, alive but bleeding. And this animal, this creature, the town, called a shadow, was carrying the message no one else could. Naomi swallowed hard, forcing her lungs to work. Her fear wanted her to retreat inside. Bolt the door. Pretend this was nothing more than a trick of exhaustion. But her reason cut through sharp and merciless. She had no choice but to act. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Okay, I hear you." She turned and sprinted back into the clinic, the old floorboards creaking under her boots. The phone sat on her desk, its cord tangled. She yanked it too. Her ear, her fingers dialing without hesitation. The ring dragged on once, twice, and then a growly voice answered, calm, but weighted with fatigue. "Sheriff McCree." Naomi's voice trembled, but held. "Sheriff, this is Naomi Bennett at the clinic." She stopped, glanced at the hat again, then forced the words out. "I found a ranger's hat. There's blood on it. It belongs to Marin Hole." There was silence on the line, not static, not a delay, just silence, as though McCree himself had forgotten to breathe. Then, low and deliberate, the voice came again. "Are you certain?" Naomi looked up through the clinic's front window. Onyx was still there, a shadow, against the snow, watching her with unwavering eyes. She blinked, and in that heartbeat, he turned, his massive body melting back into the night, each step fading until only the tracks remained. She gripped the phone harder, her voice clear and steady. "Now, I'm certain, and Sheriff, a horse brought it to me." On the other end, McCree exhaled slowly. The sound was heavy with disbelief, with the weight of a man forced to consider the impossible. Naomi set the hat gently on her desk, her fingers brushing the embroidered name one last time. The blood had dried, but the message was still fresh. Somewhere in the forest, Marin Holt was waiting, and the only reason anyone in Red Hollow knew it was because a black horse had carried the truth out of the dark. Snow still drifted down in thin veils when Naomi Bennett pushed open the heavy oak door of the Red Hollow Sheriff's office. The building glowed like a lantern in the dark, its windows lit at an hour when the town was normally long asleep. Outside, the streets lay silent, blanketed in white, but inside the air pulsed with exhaustion and tension. The office was small, paneled in old pine, the walls lined with faded maps and photographs of deputies past. The conference table at the center was buried beneath stacks of reports, scattered coffee cups, and the thick folders documenting every fruitless hour of the search for Ranger Maren Hull. 2 days of scouring the forest had yielded nothing but cold trails and restless speculation. Now, as Naomi stepped in from the storm, every head in the room turned. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold snow clinging to her hair, and in her hands she carried the Rares' hat wrapped in a towel. The weight of the object was far heavier than its fabric and stitching. The sight of it made the room go utterly still. Sheriff Elias McCree rose slowly from his chair at the head of the table. At 61, he was a tall man, gaunt slightly, stooped with years of labor, his hair the color of iron, his beard trimmed short, his eyes shadowed by lines carved from decades of quiet endurance, fixed on Naomi with an intensity that silenced the murmur of the deputies. He extended his hand, and Naomi placed the hat in it, her fingers reluctant to let go. McCree unwrapped the towel, revealing the familiar crest of the Ranger Service. His thumb brushed over the pine and star emblem, worn but unmistakable. When he turned the inner band, the stitching glimmered faintly in the lamplight. M. Halt, the sheriff's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of what the discovery meant. "It's hers," he said, voice low, growly. He lifted his gaze to the room. No more doubt. This belonged to Maren. A silence fell so complete that the crackle of the wood stove in the corner sounded like gunfire. The deputies shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some looked away, others simply stared at the blood-darkened fabric, each one confronting the reality they had tried not to voice. Maren Holt was alive when this hat was torn from her, but she was hurt badly and still in danger. Sergeant Clara Vance broke the stillness. At 36, she was lean and sharp, her hair cropped close, her bearing carrying the imprint of her years with the state patrol before she returned to her hometown. She pushed aside the stack of reports in front of her and spread a large map of the northern forest across the table. The paper was creased and smudged from use, but her finger found the spot immediately, a blotch of ink marking the northern patrol line. "Here," Clara said, tapping the area with a nail. "The old ranger cabin. It sits along Maren's last known route. She was headed north when she went dark. The cabin's within reach, and locals have been reporting strange lights in that sector for weeks." Her finger traced a line along the ridges. "It's secluded, enough to hold someone without being discovered. Out of sight, off the main trails. If she's being kept somewhere, that's our best lead." The sheriff leaned over the map, eyes narrowing. His silence stretched, but Clara held her ground. "This isn't random, Elias. Someone knew the terrain. The cabin's the only structure in that radius. We don't have time to circle the woods blindly anymore. If we want to bring her back, we start there." Before McCree could answer, a heavy voice rumbled from across the table. Deputy Hank Torres uncrossed his arms, his broad chest rising beneath the bulk of his winter jacket. At 40, Torres was a man known for his caution, bordering on stubbornness, the kind who preferred certainties carved in stone before he moved an inch. "You're basing this on what exactly?" His brows knit, his voice edged with skepticism. "On what? Some stray horse dragged into town." The room stirred, deputies exchanging glances. Torres leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Look, I don't doubt what you saw. Naomi, I don't doubt what you believe. But animals carry things all the time. Could have been scavenged from a mile off. Could have been stolen from the truck when it was found. We're ready to risk men's lives based on the wordless testimony of a damn horse." His words hung like frost in the air. A couple of deputies nodded faintly, uneasy but unwilling to challenge the logic. The air shifted, the fragile unity in the room beginning to splinter. Naomi's fists clenched at her sides. She opened her mouth, but the sheriff raised a hand, his palm broad and steady, bidding her wait. He let the silence linger, as he always did before speaking, his eyes sweeping the faces of his people. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the doorway, marking the seconds. Finally, McCree set the hat down in the center of the table with a firmness that made the coffee cups rattle. "We don't have the luxury of certainty," he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the room. Not now. We've spent 2 days chasing shadows, and this, he touched. The blood-stained crest is the first solid thing we've held in our hands. Horse or not, this hat didn't walk itself out of the woods. It belonged to Marin, and it tells us she's still out. They're hurting, waiting. He paused, letting his gaze fall on. Torres, you're right, Hank. We're risking lives. But if there's even a chance she's alive, we don't let that chance slip. Vague leads have saved men before. And this isn't vague. It's proof she bled not far from here. Torres exhaled through his nose, unconvinced, but unwilling to press further. Clara gave a short, sharp nod, her jaw set. The sheriff straightened his frame, casting a long shadow across the map. We moved before dawn, he said. Quiet and light. A small team myself, Clara, Hank, and 2 more. No sirens, no fanfare. We approach the cabin as ghosts. If someone's holding her, they won't know we're there until it's too late. The deputies leaned in as Clara quickly jotted the names onto a legal pad. McCree continued. This stays here. No leaks to the press, no whispers in the round. Diner. Panic won't bring her home, and it'll only tip whoever's out there that we're coming. He tapped the map once more with his thick finger. Cabin's our target. We start at first light. The meeting closed with the scrape of chairs and the low rustle of coats pulled from hooks. The deputies filed out to gather their gear, some still casting doubtful glances, others grim with resolve. Clara folded the map with crisp precision and slipped it under her arm. Torres lingered a moment longer, a mouth set in a thin line, then followed. Naomi stood alone at the end of the table, her eyes still fixed on the hat lying in the center. For a moment, she felt the weight of what had just been set in motion, a storm gathering in the silence. She thought of Onyx, his amber gaze meeting hers outside the clinic, the deliberate way he had laid the hat at her feet. She thought of Marin Hole bound and suffering, in some dark place of the woods, waiting for a rescue she could not see. Sheriff McCree slid the hat back into its towel, his hands gentle despite their size. He glanced at Naomi, the corners of his eyes softening for the first time that night. You did right, bringing this here, he said. His voice was quiet but steady, the kind that begged no argument. Now it's on us to finish what you and that horse started. Naomi swallowed and nodded as the sheriff carried the evidence into his office. The lamps in the room flickered, their glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks of man and beast alike, as though the forest itself was intent on keeping its secrets a little longer. But for the first time in days, there was direction, purpose, a line drawn in. The darkness. Dawn would bring answers. The forest seemed to know where he was going. The path unfolded beneath his hooves with uncanny precision. Every drift of snow, every bend of pine familiar to him. Now, after leaving the lights of Red Hollow and the human woman who had understood his message, Onyx moved soundlessly back into the wilderness. His breath came in steady plumes of white vapor that hung in the brittle air before vanishing into the dark. The cold gnawed at his nostrils and stung his eyes. But the memory of the woman suspended inside the cabin burned hotter than the frost could bite. The trees stood tall and solemn, their boughs heavy with snow, forming a silent audience to his return. Every few strides he turned his massive and head ears, pricked as though making sure the way was still marked, that the scent trail was not a dream. The night was so still. He could hear the crackle of ice shifting on the branches, the distant groan of trunks settling under their load. When the outline of the cabin finally appeared through the lattice of trees, a dark shape scarred, with the weak glow of a lamp seeping through its broken boards, he slowed his breath, coming deeper, heavier. Onyx stopped several yards away. The place smelled wrong of rot, rust, and the faint acrid sting of human sweat and blood. He lowered his head, pawed the snow once, then slammed his hoof down with a force that echoed through the night. The sound cracked, and the silence carried across the clearing like a drumbeat. He made the call rising from deep, in his chest, sharp and commanding. It was not merely the cry of a beast, but something older, more primal, a signal cast into the darkness, a declaration that he had returned. The sound reached the cabin's hollow interior. Marin Halt dangled still from the beam, her body numb from hours suspended, her vision blurred by blood pooling in her skull. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow, and each beat of her heart felt like a hammer against her temples. She had drifted in and out of consciousness so many times she no longer trusted her sense of time. The 1-5 The cabin's silence pressed in on her like a weight broken only by the creak of rope when she shifted and the faint hiss of wind through the boards. Then she heard it, the sharp crack of hooves stamping snow. A pause, another. Then the long, thunderous neigh that reverberated through the wooden walls. It shuddered through her chest, pulling her back from the haze. Her eyes fluttered open, stinging with sweat and salt. She blinked, listening. It was impossible, yet undeniable. An animal, a horse. She had heard it before, faintly, as though in a dream. But now it was real, cutting through the storm and her weakness. With a desperate surge of will, she curled her legs upward and let her boot heels fall against the warped planks beneath her. The sound was pitifully faint, though just a hollow tap of leather against wood, but it was all she had. She waited, heart pounding in her ears. Outside, Onyx's ears swiveled sharply. He tilted his head, amber eyes narrowing. He heard it, a muted rhythm, faint but deliberate. He pawed the snow again, stamping hard, then released a deep neigh in response, low and resonant, as if to say, "I hear you." Inside, Maren closed her eyes, forcing another weak kick against the beam. The dull thud was barely audible, even to her, but it was something. The moment the answering call rolled back to her, she let out a broken sob that sounded more like a gasp. She wasn't alone. Something was there. In the dark, in the cold, suspended like prey, she had a link now, a signal, a lifeline. The fragile connection was shattered by another sound. Upstairs, the boards groaned beneath a different weight. Heavy footsteps, uneven but purposeful, thudded across the floor. A man's voice, ragged and sharp, split the quiet. "What the hell is that?" Ray Harker, 55, lumbered across the cabin's upper floor, his shadow blotting out the thin lamplight as he yanked a flashlight from the con table. His flannel coat hung loose on his broad shoulders, its fabric torn and stained his belly, pressing against the buttons. His beard was greasy, flecked with crumbs, his eyes wild and sunken. He muttered as he moved, words tripping over one another in a fevered whisper. "They don't leave me alone. Never leave me alone. Think you can trick me, huh? Think you can scream and scratch and I won't hear it." The horse's neigh had rattled him. His mind, already frayed from years of bitterness and solitude, twisted the sound into an omen. His hand went to the folding knife clipped to his belt. The blade snapped open with a metallic click, gleaming dully under the weak beam of his flashlight. He stomped toward the stairs, the boards creaking and squealing under his weight. "No peace. Never peace. You all want me gone. You'll learn." Maren froze. Every step of his descent was agony to her nerves, each squeal of the rusted nails screaming danger. Her throat worked soundlessly as she tried to summon strength she no longer had. Her head lolled against her shoulder, but her eyes fixed toward the cracks in the boards where the faintest shadow of movement hinted at the horse outside. Onyx heard him too, the rhythm of boots descending, the sour stench of sweat and stale tobacco spilling through the cracks. His muscles bunched beneath his skin, the line of his back taut as a bowstring, a growl low and guttural built deep in his chest. Horses were not meant to make such sounds, but this was no ordinary stallion. It was the noise of warning, of rage vibrating through the cold night air. He advanced each step, shaking the ground until his massive frame loomed against the cabin wall. He struck the rotted boards with his hoof, the impact rattling the structure. Flakes of frost raining from the roof. His shadow, huge and hulking, stretched through the cracks, darkening the dim interior. Inside, Maren's heart surged. She tapped her boot again, weaker now, but more deliberate. A reply, a confession to herself that she was not imagining it. There was something outside, something vast and defiant. She wasn't abandoned, not yet. The footsteps grew louder, descending closer. The beam of Ray's flashlight slicing through the gloom of the stairwell. His knife caught the light, flashing silver. He hissed through his teeth. The sound, half snarl, half laugh. "Who's out there? You want to die? Then come on, step right in, beast man. I'll gut you just the same." The words echoed through the cabin, bouncing against the damp walls. Maren held her breath, her body trembling from pain and exhaustion. She knew the edge of the blade, the madness in his voice, but her eyes remained locked on the thin line of light spilling from the broken doorframe where she knew the horse stood. The shadow of his ears flicked against the boards, and the weight of his presence filled her like a shield. Onyx did not retreat. His eyes burned in the dark, his breath fogging the cracks, his hoof pawing once more with a force that shook the ground. He had heard the challenge, and he had already chosen where he stood. The confrontation was seconds away. Ray Harker's flashlight beam cut jagged lines across the cabin's damp timbers as he stumbled closer to the prisoner. The air wire of mold, sweat, and the cold metal, but he seemed to savor it, drawing the stench in through his teeth, like fuel. His boot struck the planks in uneven thuds, the sound amplified in the hollow, the belly of the room. He lifted the light and aimed it at Maren Holt. Her face, swollen from hours of blood pooling in her head, reflected the stark white glare. Her skin had turned an unnatural shade, lips split, and raw eyes heavy but unbroken. Ray's expression twisted into something cruel as he tilted his head, studying her as though she were an animal on display. "Look at you," he rasped. His voice was shredded by decades of cigarettes, low and serrated, dripping with bitterness. "The proud uniform, always walking tall, thinking you're above the rest of us. And now," he gestured with a theatrical sweep of his knife, the steel flickering inches from her nose. "Now you're the animal, hanging, like a carcass in a slaughterhouse." The blade wavered close enough for Maren to feel the cold breath of its edge. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, but her eyes, half-lidded bloodshot, remained fixed on him with a steadiness that sparked his fury. She did not beg. She did not cry. Even drained her gaze carried defiance. "You think you're better?" He snarled, his mouth foaming with spit. "You think your badge makes you untouchable, but you don't protect people like me. You took the forest. You took the work. You sent us home like garbage. You left me nothing but the trees whispering my name." His words devolved into mutters, curses mashed together with fragments of memories only he could see. "I'll make you know the pain. Make you hang until your eyes burst. Then maybe you'll understand what you did to me." The knife trembled in his grip, not with mercy, but with attention, of a man desperate to see fear in the eyes of his victim. Yet Maren gave him none. Every ragged breath hurt, every heartbeat screamed for her to close her eyes, but she held them open. A ranger's stare, a final act of defiance. Ray's fury boiled. He raised the knife, higher, and then the world shook. The door behind him exploded in a crash of splintered wood and flying snow. Rotten hinges shrieked as they tore free. The slab of timber, crashing inward with a boom that rattled the beams. The gust of night air carried snowflakes and frost swirling like ash through the lamplight. Through the storm stepped a shadow larger than life. Onyx burst into the room with the force of a falling tree, his black coat bristling his mane, wild, his breath streaming white clouds. The flashlight beam caught his eyes, reflecting them as molten amber lit with fury. In the confined space, the horse was colossal, his body filling the doorway, his neck arched low, ears pinned flat. Maren's mouth opened in shock. For a heartbeat, she thought she had slipped into some fevered dream. A horse here in the basement where she hung, but no hallucination carried the smell of snow and the heat of breath, the thunder of hooves rattling the ground beneath her. He was real, and he was standing between her and death. Ray staggered back several paces, the knife still raised, but his hand shaking. His voice cracked as he spat. What the hell is this?" Onyx answered with a sound that made the walls quiver, and a high and furious echoing off the calm stone foundation like a trumpet of war. The vibration thudded in Ray's chest, stealing his breath for a moment. The man's bravado faltered. His eyes darted between the knife in his hand and the hulking mass of muscle bearing down on him. But rage and madness clung to him like a second skin. He snarled, thrusting the rock, blade forward in a clumsy arc. Onyx struck the floor with his hoof, the blow reverberating through the planks like a drumbeat. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The horse stepped forward, deliberate and slow, every motion promising violence. His nostrils flared, breath snorting in short, explosive bursts. "Back!" Ray shouted, though his voice shook, betraying him. "Back, or I'll cut you to pieces." The knife wavered. Sweat rolled down his temple. Onyx lowered his head further, muscles rippling his eyes, never leaving Ray. His hooves clicked against the boards as he advanced, each step heavier than the last. The air grew tighter, charged, as though the cabin itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. Maren's heart pounded. From where she hung, she could see it all, the trembling blade, the enormous horse closing the gap, the madness flickering in Ray's eyes. She could barely breathe, but her spirit surged. For the first time since her capture, hope sparked like a flare in the void. Onyx suddenly threw his head back and screamed. The neigh tore through, and the cabin like a blast of thunder, deafening, violent and full of fury. Ray flinched his knife, lowering a fraction as he staggered against the wall, ears ringing from the sheer force of the sound. The horse stomped again, shaking the floor so hard that loose dirt and flakes of rot rained from the ceiling. The room seemed to shrink, pressing Ray into the corner, the knife still in his grip, but trembling visibly now. Ray's, the breath came in gasps faster and faster, while Onyx's came steady, controlled. The difference was unbearable. He licked his lips, muttering under his breath, "No, no, not me. I won't lose. Not to you. Not to a beast." But the words tasted hollow. His hand trembled, the knife twitching dangerously close to dropping. His eyes, once boiling with rage, now gleamed with something else, fear. Marin shifted her boot, scraping faintly against the beam. The noise was soft, almost nothing, but it was enough. Onyx flicked an ear toward her, a quick acknowledgement, then turned his gaze back on Ray, his body rigid, unmovable, a wall of fury and muscle. The man's chest heaved, his shoulders pressed against the wall as though he could sink through it. He muttered again, louder this time, I won't be beaten." And then he screamed, a ragged, broken cry of defiance as he pushed himself off the wall and lunged forward, knife raised high. It all collapsed into motion. Onyx surged to meet him, the full power of his frame crashing forward. His shoulder drove into the knife arm with the weight of a battering ram. The blade flashed, then clattered to the ground as the man was thrown off balance. The walls trembled with the impact. The stallion's neigh ripped through the cabin, a battle cry that drowned out Ray's own scream. The boards groaned under the strain as the animal's hooves struck and scraped sparks of fury embodied. The confined space filled with the chaos of colliding worlds. The madman's flailing desperation against the primal force of the wild. For Marin, time slowed. Suspended helpless, she could only watch as beast and man collided beneath her, and shadows, writhing in the narrow light of the swinging flashlight. She felt every vibration through the rope that bound her, every thunderous crash of hoof against wood, every scream of denial from Ray Harker. It was not man against horse. It was darkness against light. The forest was alive with moving shadows. Beams of light flickered between the trunks as a small team pressed forward each step, deliberate each breath, muffled by scarves and the snow beneath their boots. The storm had thinned, leaving only flurries that drifted like ash, but the cold still cut deep. Sheriff Elias McCree led the way. His revolver rested steady in his right hand, and the barrel angled low, his eyes scanning every gap between the pines. At 61, his joints ached with the cold, but his movements betrayed no hesitation. He had spent decades hunting through these woods, and tonight every instinct hummed. Behind him, Sergeant Clara Vance advanced with a carbine tight to her shoulder. Her jaw was set, eyes narrowed. In focus, the beam of her flashlight slicing ahead. She raised a hand, suddenly palm out, a silent signal to halt. The cabin was in sight. Through the trees, the silhouette of the old ranger station appeared, its roof sagging under snow, its walls glowing faintly from the fractured light of a lantern inside. Deputy Hank Torres crouched lower, his tactical light held against his forearm, the edge of his mouth tight with tension. His bulk moved with surprising care for a man his size, but his breathing was heavy mist puffing from his beard. Naomi Bennett brought up the rear, a medical kit strapped to her shoulder. She had no weapon, but her eyes held steel. Every crunch of snow beneath her boots echoed with the urgency of the hat that had brought them here. Then they heard it, a shrill, furious neigh carried across the clearing, followed by the thunder of hooves slamming wood. The sound tore through the trees, followed by the groan of beams under strain. The four officers froze, exchanging sharp glances. McCree's voice dropped to a rasp. "Something's happening in there. Be ready." The team pressed forward, fanning out until the cabin loomed close, its boards groaning under some internal struggle. From within, a man's scream rang out ragged and violent. "I'll cut you to pieces, you hear me?" A moment, and later came another crash, followed by the unmistakable roar of a horse shaking the walls. Clara glanced at the sheriff. Her eyes burned with resolve. She whispered, "We go now. We don't let this turn into a corpse recovery." McCree gave a single nod. The team moved as one circling the structure. Clara raised 2 fingers, then swept her hand in a practiced motion, surround 3 sides. Leave one open. Hank slipped to the left, McCree to the front, Clara to the right. Naomi, hovering close behind with her kit ready. The stench of mold and damp snow seeped through the cracks, mingling with the copper tang of blood. Ray's voice bellowed again, broken and unhinged. "You're mine. You all belong to me." And then came the sound of hooves slamming down again, the kind of sound no man could mistake a beast on the attack. Clara drew in a sharp breath, her voice low but cutting, breaching. "No one dies tonight, not her, not us. Move." The front of the cabin had already been shattered by Onyx's earlier assault. The door lay in splinter snow, spilling across the threshold. McCree surged through first revolver, sweeping the room, and the others flooded in behind him. The scene inside froze them in place. Ray Harker still clutched his knife, staggering forward with spit flying from his lips. But before his arm could descend, Onyx lunged. The stallion's entire frame coiled and released in a single explosive motion, his shoulder slamming into Ray with the force of a battering ram. The impact lifted the man off his feet, hurling him across the room like a rag doll. He crashed into the wall, the knife spinning from his hand and embedding itself into the rotten floorboards with a metallic clang. Ray crumpled, breath bursting from him in a wheeze. He writhed, trying to rise, but Onyx was already on him. The horse reared slightly, then slammed a hoof, down inches from Ray's skull, the floorboards trembling under the strike. Steam gushed from his nostrils in great clouds, his man wild, his eyes blazing amber fire. For a moment, everyone in the cabin froze. McCree revolver raised. Clara rifle. Steady. Hank midstride. Naomi hand pressed against her kit. All of them witnesses to something no training could prepare them for. A wild horse towering in furious standing guard over a human captive like a sworn protector. McCree's breath caught in his chest. "Jesus almighty," he muttered. Rye whimpered under the shadow of the beast, his earlier rage unraveling into incoherent cries. He twisted, scrabbling, for the knife. But Hank Torres was faster. The deputy lunged forward, tackling Ray's arm and yanking it behind. His back. The man howled, thrashing like a caught animal. "You don't get it. None of you get it," he shrieked, spittle spraying across the floor. "Shut your mouth," Hank growled, forcing the man's face against the boards. His bulk pinned Ray easily, though the prisoner bucked and writhed. McCree holstered his weapon and strode, forward the weight of authority in every step. He pressed a knee into Ray's back and snapped cold steel around his wrists. The click of the handcuffs rang sharp in the smoky air. "It's over," McCree said. His voice was calm, final. Clara swept the corners of the cabin, her carbine angled, ensuring no other shadows lurked in the gloom. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by Ray's ragged curses, and the rhythmic snorts of Onyx, whose hoof remained planted firmly beside the man's head. The crisis was not over. Marin Hole still hung limp from the beam, her body pale and trembling. Naomi broke from the group, her instincts overriding all else. She rushed to Marin's side eyes, already cataloging the damage. The ranger's wrists and ankles were raw, where the ropes cut deep, her face mottled with blood, pooling from being inverted so long. "Hold her steady," Naomi ordered, her voice firm, despite her racing heart. Clara sheathed her knife and stepped close. In a swift motion, she sliced through the cords, binding Marin's wrists. McCree moved to catch her, lowering the ranger gently as the last ropes gave way. Marin collapsed into their arms, her chest heaving weakly. Naomi laid her down carefully on the cabin floor, her hands already at work. She tilted Marin onto her side, cleared her airway, and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A faint pulse fluttered beneath the skin. Relief softened Naomi's shoulders, though her eyes stayed sharp. "She's alive," Naomi said, her tone laced with urgency. She pulled a thermal blanket from her pack and wrapped it around the rare's trembling body. "Her vitals are weak, but she's conscious. We need to keep her warm." Marin's lips parted, a whisper escaping so soft Naomi almost missed it. "Horse." Naomi leaned closer. "What? Marin? What is it?" Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see past Naomi's shoulder. Onyx loomed above breath, fogging the air, his massive frame filling the corner of the cabin. Marin's lips cracked into the faintest smile. "He saved me." Naomi's throat tightened. She brushed a strand of damp hair from Marin's forehead. "You're safe now. We've got you." Behind them, Clara secured a bandage around Marin's ankle, while McCree checked the bindings on Ray. The prisoner still muttered through clenched teeth, his voice a litany of curses and nonsense, but no one paid him mind now. The focus was on the ranger alive, against all odds. For a long moment, the cabin was quiet, except for the sound of breathing. Marin's shallow gasps raise, resentful snarls, and the steady, resonant exhale of Onyx. Then slowly the others turned. The horse stood unmoving, his chest rising and falling like a bellow, and steam billowing from his nostrils. His black coat gleamed under the flashlight beams, every muscle tense yet controlled. Snow clung to his mane and shoulders, sparkling like silver against the dark. His eyes burned with an intelligence that none of them could deny. No one spoke, even Torres, still, gripping Ray by the cuffs, found his gaze drawn upward. It was Naomi who finally broke the silence, her voice soft with awe. He brought us here. He kept her alive. McCree swallowed his lying face, shadowed with something almost reverent. He let out a breath that trembled slightly as he whispered, "We just got schooled in duty by a horse." The others said nothing, but the truth of his words hung in the air like scripture. The interrogation room at Red Hollow's small sheriff's office smelled of stale coffee and cold metal. Its walls, paneled in wood decades old, held every whisper and curse that had ever been thrown inside. Tonight, it held the breathing of a broken man. Ray Harker sat slumped in, the chair wrists cuffed, his face swollen with bruises from his struggle in the cabin. His beard was matted with dried blood, his shirt torn and stained with dirt. The fury that had once driven his wild eyes now flickered like a dying fire. But it had not gone out. Every so often he raised his head and stared at the mirrored glass with a mixture of suspicion and defiance. Sergeant Clara Vance entered file in hand. She dropped it onto the table with a firm slap. The sound made Ray flinch, though he tried to cover it with a sneer. Why Marin Holt? Clara's voice was level. Deliberate? Why a ranger she ever do anything to you? Ray's lips curled into a crooked grin. He let out a hollow chuckle that scraped across the room. I didn't pick her. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with something twisted. They told me to. Clara's stomach tightened. She glanced through the glass at Sheriff McCree, who stood watching, arms folded. Then she pressed harder. Who told you? Rye laughed again, low and unsteady, then slapped his palms against the table, making the cuffs rattle. A man in a white van came creeping around the woods, said, "There's people no one remembers, cops, rangers, runaways, easy, prey. No one misses them when they're gone." Clara leaned closer. And you believed him? Ray's voice cracked into a near shout. He promised me, said I'd get them back. My wife, my little girl, said if I helped, he could give them back. His breath came ragged, spit flying as his face contorted between rage and despair. I'm not the villain. I'm the puppet on the strings they tied. McCree stepped into the room. His lined face shadowed, his eyes fixed on Ray. For a moment, he studied the man, the broken vessel of violence and grief, and then said quietly, "This is bigger than you, isn't it?" Ray's head dropped forward, shoulders shaking. His laugh was no longer cruel. It was hollow, empty. "You have no idea," he muttered. McCree and Clara exchanged a glance. Whatever nightmare they had walked into, in that cabin, it wasn't just the madness of one man. It was something wider, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, federal cars rolled into Red Hollow. Their tires cracked the frost on the roads. Their radios buzzed with clipped voices. News had traveled fast. Agent Marcus Hanley stepped out onto the snow-crusted street, his long coat sweeping behind him. He was tall and lean, his hair peppered gray, his eyes a clear blue that cut with precision. He had spent 20 years in the FBI's missing persons unit, and his presence carried the weight of those years. Inside the sheriff's office, he wasted no time. The map of the county was spread across the conference table, dotted with pins and notes. Hanley tapped a finger against the drawing of Red Hollow's forest. "This wasn't an isolated act," he said flatly. "We've been tracking incidents across 3 counties. White van, unmarked plates, fake IDs. Victims have one thing in common. They're the forgotten ones, the easy ones, people the world doesn't watch." Clara folded her arms, listening. McCree stood stiff beside her. Hanley continued, "Your Rears's disappearance fits the profile. So did the children we found in Cold Pines 2 years ago. So did 2 drifters gone missing last winter. And Ray Harker, he's just one of the pawns they use." Naomi Bennett, seated at the edge of the table, shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't law enforcement, but she had seen the terror in Marin's eyes, the bruises on her wrists. She leaned forward. "So, you're saying he wasn't lying? Someone else, someone organized, put him up to this?" Hanley's blue eyes locked on hers. He wasn't lying. We're not chasing one. Lunatic. We're chasing a network. And they're not done. McCree's jaw clenched. He looked around. The table, his voice rough. Red Hollow won't let them take another soul. We'll work with you, whatever it takes. Hanley gave a single nod. Then we start tonight. But the horse was gone. After the cabin raid, while the deputies secured Rye and Naomi worked over, Marin Onyx had slipped into the storm. When McCree turned to thank the creature, or perhaps to confirm with his own eyes what he had seen, the doorway was empty. The snow beyond was disturbed only by hoof prints already filling with drifting flakes. By morning, the prints were gone. Whispers spread through town like fire. On dry grass. Someone claimed to have glimpsed a shadow at the treeane, a hulking shape, watching silently. Another swore they heard a neigh echoing through the storm at dawn, but no one could say for sure. Marin, recovering in the clinic, opened her eyes one night and whispered hoarsely to Naomi the horse. "Where is he?" Naomi brushed her hand gently across the rear's arm. "He's gone," she admitted softly. "Gone the way he came." A hollow settled in Marin's chest. One, Naomi recognized. It was the same hollowest that weighed over the whole town, as if a guardian had descended, saved them, and vanished back into myth before they could even say thank you. Naomi Bennett refused to believe the story was over. She remembered the weight of the Rares' hat dropped at her door and the intelligence burning in Onyx's eyes, the way he had seemed to choose her as the messenger. She knew bone deep that he would not vanish forever. Sitting at her kitchen table with Danny, Kepler, her oldest friend, and a mechanic with grease-stained hands, she laid out her plan. "He trusted me," she said quietly. "He asked me to understand. If he risked that once, he might risk it again." Danny leaned back, skeptical but not dismissive. "You're talking about baiting a ghost, Naomi. That horse isn't a pet. He's wild." Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile. Wild doesn't mean unreachable. Together, they began preparations. Danny hauled hay from the feed store, spreading fragrant piles along the trail that wound from the clinic to the edge of the forest. Naomi cut strips of cloth from Marin's blood-stained jacket, tying them to branches where the wind could carry the scent. She scattered mineral salt across the blue snow, knowing how desperately horses sought it in the lean depths of winter. At dusk, the forest stood dark and still. Naomi crouched near the trail, her flashlight off her breath, visible in the cold. She waited, her heart pounding with every snap of a twig. Danny sat nearby, arms crossed, muttering, "You really are talking to it like it understands." Naomi's eyes never left the treeane. "Maybe it does," she whispered. Danny gave a low chuckle. "Then, maybe it talks back." She smiled faintly, her voice barely audible. "If he comes back, it won't be because he owes us. It'll be because he chooses to." It happened on a morning thick with fog. The sun had not yet cleared the mountains. The forest loomed, its edges blurred in pale mist. Naomi walked the path again, her boots crunching softly, her breath caught in her throat. She carried no bait this time, only hope, and then she saw it. A shadow moved within the fog, vast and deliberate. For a moment, she thought it was another trick of the mist, some phantom conjured by her longing. But then, it stepped forward. Snow shifted beneath colossal hooves. Muscles rolled beneath a coat black as coal, though thinner now with ribs faintly visible. His mane was tangled, his scarred shoulder more pronounced than before. Yet his eyes, amber, fierce, undimed, cut through the haze. Onyx had returned. The air seemed to stop. People who had gathered quietly along the path. Shopkeepers, children, elders wrapped in scarves, fell utterly silent. Every breath held, every gaze fixed. Onyx advanced slowly, each step sinking deep into the crust of snow. His breath billowed like smoke, his presence filling the clearing with something both primal and holy. He stopped a few feet from Naomi and lowered his head. It was no bow, it was a greeting. Naomi's hand trembled as she reached forward, her palm brushing against the warmth of his neck. Tears stung her eyes, but she smiled through them. "Heroes don't disappear," she whispered. "They just need time to return." The crowd broke. Murmurs swelled into gasps, then into cheers. Someone shouted, "The forest sent us a guardian." Another cried, "He's the Sentinel." Onyx did not react to the noise. His eyes never left Naomi's. For that moment, it was only the two of them, the healer who had once mended him in secret, and the wild colossus who had come back not for debt, but for choice. Snow muffled every sound in the valley except the steady crunch of boots and the low hum of radios. For many weeks, the FBI team had combed through maps, reviewed grainy security footage, and chased dead ends. But now they had found something solid. Fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the snow, leading the way toward Cold Pines. Agent Marcus. Hanley crouched beside them, his gloved hand brushing the indentations. The tracks were sharp, clean, recent. He rose, his breath hanging in the air, and gestured toward the abandoned scout camp. The place had stood empty for 15 years. Its cabins sagged under neglect into roofs caved in paint long peeled. The forest had swallowed it, reclaiming the trails, hiding its secrets. But tonight, faint light flickered through a cracked door of the main lodge. Hanley's voice was flat, certain. They're using this as a staging ground. If we wait, we lose them. Sheriff Elias McCree nodded, his jaw set. Then we moved before dawn. The next hours were a blur of preparation. Federal agents checked weapons, adjusted radios, rehearsed hand signals. McCree's deputies gathered in tight circles, listening to final instructions. Clara Vance laid out the approach on a map, tapping a gloved finger at the camp's perimeter. Naomi Bennett stood apart, a medical kit strapped to her shoulder. She had no weapon, but her eyes followed every move. She wasn't supposed to be there, but McCree hadn't sent her home. Something about this mission, about what they might find inside that van, demanded her presence. Then, as the team assembled at the treine, a sound broke the quiet, the heavy cadence of hooves on snow. The dark shape appeared first as a shadow among shadows, then as a form one could mistake. Onyx stepped into view, massive and steady, his breath streaming like smoke. His black coat glimmered with frost, his mane tangled with ice, his eyes sharp as amber fire. The team froze, but McCree didn't. He watched the horse, then gave a single nod, almost reverent. Back again, he murmured, louder for all to hear. He knows the way. Let him lead. No one argued. Onyx moved forward each stride, purposefully carving a path through snowdrifts. The agents and deputies followed, boots sinking into the trail he broke. Naomi walked just behind his flank, her heart pounding with a strange mix of awe and trust. It was as if the forest itself had sent a guide. The Cold Pines camp rose out of the dark, like a graveyard of wood and iron. Cabins leaned at crooked angles, porches. Sagged windows stared hollow and blind. And against one decaying structure, the van waited, white stray with rust, its engine silent. Two men lingered outside, stamping their feet against the cold shotguns slung across their shoulders. Their eyes scanned the treine without focus, unaware of the silent figures closing in. At Hanley's signal, the FBI agents surged forward. Shouts cut the air. Federal agents, drop your weapons! The two men froze, startled, then fumbled for their guns. But they never had a chance. Clara swept in from the side carbine, raised. Within seconds, the men were disarmed, shoved face first into the snow, their wrists bound. Hanley's eyes snapped to the van. Its windows were blacked out, its doors sealed with chains. From within came a sound that pierced the cold, a muffled sob. Naomi stepped closer, her breath catching. She pressed her ear against the metal. "Children," she whispered. "There are children inside." McCree's voice cut through growly and urgent. "Get it open now." But the chains were reinforced, welded crudely but strong. The agents tugged and cursed. The van shuddered but held from inside. The sobs turned to whimpers, then cries. Onyx moved. The stallion's body trembled with a low growl, his hooves pawing the snow. His breath came hot white clouds bursting from flared nostrils. Then, and without hesitation, he lunged. His shoulders slammed into the back doors with a thunder that echoed through the camp. The metal groaned again. He struck the chains, rattling, bolts straining. Snow burst upward with each impact, his muscles rippling under. The strain. On the third blow, the doors gave way. The chain snapped hinges, screamed, and the doors flew open, crashing against the van's sides. Inside, two children crouched in the shadows, a boy and a girl no older than 9, their wrists bound with plastic ties, their faces pale and stray with tears. They flinched at the sudden light until they saw him. Onyx lowered his head, his breath warm as it rolled into the van. He nudged forward, inviting them. Trembling, the boy reached out and clung to the thick black man. The girl followed, burying her face against the stallion's neck. Their sobs broke into gasps, relief flooding their small bodies. Naomi rushed forward, her hands quick to cut the bindings, her voice soft and steady. "You're safe now, you're safe." She wrapped them in blankets, checked their pulses, stroked their hair. Behind, McCree's eyes glistened in the glow of flashlights. He whispered almost to himself, "Damn, Horse just saved them." A camera clicked, then another. One of the local reporters embedded with the FBI team had captured it. All the doors exploding open, the children clutching the horse's mane, the stallion standing like a guardian in the snow. By dawn, the images spread across newswires. By noon, they were everywhere. Onyx framed against the white storm, his eyes burning. 2 children pressed against him alive. Headlines screamed, "The Black Sentinel." News anchors spoke his name as though it were legend. Commentators debated, was he a miracle, a symbol, or simply an animal with uncanny instincts? For Red Hollow, there was no debate. They knew. 1 week later, the town gathered in the square. The stage was simple wooden planks, folding chairs, flags rippling in the cold wind. Children sat on shoulders, old men leaned on canes, women wrapped scarves tighter around their faces. Everyone was there, drawn by something greater than ceremony. Sheriff McCree climbed the steps slowly, a small box in his hands. His hair was silver under the winter sun, his shoulders heavy with years of service. When he reached the podium, he spoke with quiet gravity. "In my life, I've seen duty carried by men and women. I have seen sacrifice. I have seen courage. But nothing like what these woods gave us." McCree opened the small wooden box. Inside lay a silver tag, engraved with steady hands, "Sentinel of the Forest, Onyx." He turned to the edge of the stage. There, Onyx stood, massive and wild, snow still clinging to his hooves, his mane tangled like storm clouds. Yet his eyes steady, Ancient watched in silence, as if he already knew. McCree slipped the tag onto a strip of leather and fastened it around the stallion's neck. Onyx reared, loosing a cry that cut through the night, a sound that seemed to shake the very bones of Red Hollow. The mountains carried it back, echoing again and again, until the crowd's cheer roared like thunder. Marin Holt stepped forward, her scars visible but her spirit unbroken. She gripped the podium, her voice trembling before finding steel. "The night I was taken, I thought I would die in that cabin. But I wasn't alone. My brothers and sisters fought for me, and something else fought too, something the forest sent. Onyx is no ordinary horse. He is proof that even in our darkest hours, nature still stands guard if we choose to listen." Silence fell. Then applause rose, fierce and endless, tears glinting in the cold air. Months later, the thaw came. Snow melted into rivers that carried life back into the earth. At the edge of a new field, Naomi Bennett hammered a sign into the soil, "Second Chance Project." Her dream had taken root, a haven for the broken, the wounded, the forgotten. Dogs scarred by chains, horses abandoned to hunger, creatures left behind by cruelty. And at the heart of it all was Onyx. He was never stabled, never tamed. He roamed as he pleased, sometimes vanishing into the forest for days, only to return when he was needed most. On Saturdays, children gathered at the field, eyes wide as they touched his mane, fed him apples, listened as Naomi spoke of survival and strength. He had become more than a ghost in the forest. He was guardian, protector, legend. And sometimes, at dusk, Naomi would spot him high on the ridge, the dying sun painting his black coat in fire. Onyx would stand unmoving, watching Red Hollow below, silent, patient, eternal. But one evening, as the last light bled from the horizon, Naomi noticed something new. Onyx was not alone. Beside him, half hidden in the trees, stood a smaller shadow, sleek, dark, and watchful. A colt, his colt. The town had thought Onyx was the last of his kind. But now, against the fading sun, 2 silhouettes stood side by side. The Sentinel of the Forest and his heir.